The American colonies got their start with Roanoke, Jamestown, and the Mayflower. Now they numbered 13. Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, Maryland, Delaware, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, New York, Connecticut, Rhode Island, New Hampshire, and Massachusetts. And your ancestors were there. Well, in almost every colony. England and King George III were in charge, and the colonists weren't very happy. John Hancock and Sam Adams were two that were especially unhappy with the king, and the king knew it. In 1765, the king made most everyone angry with a tax he put on paper called the Stamp Act. The citizens were upset and began to protest and aggravate the king even more. They decided to get organized. One group that formed in 1767 was called the Sons of Liberty. There was no email or Facebook back then, so they had to have a way to communicate quietly and still let everyone know what mischief the king was up to. Committees of correspondence were formed in most of the colonies, beginning in Massachusetts. A Barber ancestor, Oliver Humphrey, was a member of one of these committees in Simsbury, Massachusetts. The goal was to unite the people. Then in 1773 came the tax on tea, and the colonists had had enough of being taxed with no say in the matter. So they organized a protest and tossed the tea from a newly arrived ship into the Boston harbor. Paul Revere was one of the men who participated, but Sam Adams gave the orders. More organization was needed, so a Continental Congress was formed in 1774 with representatives from all the colonies. The king got even angrier and labeled men like Hancock and Sam Adams traitors. By 1775, things began to happen, and they happened fast. In April, the British General Gage heard the rebellious colonists were collecting ammunition in Lexington, so he sent 700 men to get it and to capture the traitors Hancock and Adams. Paul Revere rode to sound an alarm, and the first real battle of the Revolutionary War took place. There wasn't a real army at the time, but citizen militias that were called out. 3 of our ancestors were there: Barber ancestor John Brown, Swift ancestor Josiah Putnam, and Gamble ancestor Abraham Shaw. Despite the fact he was a Quaker, Jackman ancestor Samuel Howland was one of the group that marched right afterwards to help. The next month, Fort Ticonderoga was captured from the British, but a Barber ancestor, Eldad Andrus, was taken prisoner and held for months, finally managing to escape and return to Vermont. In June, the Continental Congress named George Washington as commander of the Continental troops, and he started to get his army organized. Just a few days later was the famous battle at Bunker Hill near Boston. Gamble ancestor Captain Abraham Shaw was in that fight. By this time, the colonists had to take sides. Less than half actually supported the rebel cause, and they were called patriots. Another quarter wanted to stay neutral or just keep quiet. But about a fourth of the people wanted to stay loyal to the king and were called loyalists, Tories, or redcoats. There were several attempts at involving the Canadians across the border, but they failed. Jackman ancestor Benjamin Fenton was part of an invasion into Quebec and Montreal in 1775. In July 1776, the delegates to the Continental Congress met and signed an historic document, the Declaration of Independence, making them all traitors to the king, but determined to be an independent country. John Hancock was the president of the Congress and was the first to sign with his large, beautiful signature. In September, a Barber ancestor, Captain John Brown, who'd been at Lexington and was part of the Army in New York, died of a disease that was spreading throughout the camp. He was the grandfather of the abolitionist John Brown. In December, the British captured Newport, Rhode Island, and Gamble ancestor Captain Abraham Shaw and Barber ancestor Sergeant Seth Richmond were called to march in response. Later in December, with the British in New York, George Washington crossed the Delaware River and defeated Cornwallis at the Battle of Trenton. A recent immigrant from Ireland, Gamble ancestor Billy McCoy, was there. In June 1777, the Congress decided the colonies needed a flag, and Betsy Ross made one with 13 stars and 13 stripes. In the fall of 1777, Jackman ancestor Alex Jameson was at the Battle of Saratoga when the British were defeated. The cold winter of 1777-78 was a training time for Washington and his troops at Valley Forge. Irish Billy McCoy was there again. In 1780, British General Cornwallis was trying to continue a string of victories in the South when things changed. Colonel William Campbell and his over-the-mountain men were in search of the British when they went past the home of Peter Barber's ancestor, John Wesley Mullins, in North Carolina. John grabbed his gun and joined them on their way to Kings Mountain. It was a decisive victory. John was also known as Butting John because he liked to ram his opponents with his head. Another of Peter's ancestors, Samuel Stidham, served in 1780 as a guard for ammunition. He told a story of a soldier being killed by a falling tree, having to bury him and then catch up with the rest of the soldiers. The last major battle that marked the unofficial end of the war was at Yorktown in 1781, where British General Cornwallis surrendered. It wasn't until 1783 that the Treaty of Paris made it official. We were an independent country with more territory than just the original 13 colonies. Besides the ancestors mentioned, many others served, such as Peter's ancestors Robert Murden and John Lips, Gamble ancestors George Bruner and James Gillis, Jackman ancestors Abner Jackman and William Wakeman, Swift ancestors Roland Champlin and Josiah Putnam, Barber ancestors Jonathan Barber and Cornelius Teachout, and others. All were part of a large group of American patriots winning the battle for independence.